understanding of the war and the question of genocide, and just really appreciate the essays you've been putting out. I feel like I've every few months you've read something that's just really helped for me concretize my own questions and thoughts. So I just want to start with, and if you see me looking to the left, I'm looking at my questions, not texting somebody. But just as a scholar of genocide, particularly the Holocaust, you've spent many decades thinking about how mass violence becomes possible through institutions, language, military structure, everyday participation by regular people. Um, what drew you, let's just to start with your work in general, what drew you to that line of research, and what are some of the questions that have guided you?
So first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here. And it's nice to see you again, Aaron. What drew me, this is a sort of lifelong preoccupation. I guess in part it has to do with growing up in Israel. I was born in the mid 1950s in a country where many of my neighbors, many of the people in the neighborhood were Holocaust survivors, a country that had just been created itself by fire and sword. When I was 13, the War of 67 occurred. When I was 18, just entered the army, the War of 1973 happened. So there was a lot of violence around. There were also a lot of remnants of a violence that wasn't being spoken about, which was the expulsion of the Palestinians. So I grew up surrounded not only with people who had tattoos on their forearms because they had survived the Holocaust, but also surrounded by what was called then abandoned property, meaning the remnants of Palestinian villages that had been evicted, expelled from Israel. Uh, so all of this, plus my own army experience, made me more and more interested in why people participate in violence. And the angle that interested me in particular, and I think that guided me from the very beginning, when I was writing my dissertation at Oxford in the early 1980s to this day, was the individual level, not so much how these things are being organized from the top, but rather how are people motivated to participate in violence? What is the pattern of educating or indoctrinating them? How do they respond to that violence? How do they explain that to themselves? Um, and so this is something that has guided me throughout. And as you could see from the subtitle of my previous book, I've become increasingly interested in first person history. That is also how do people write and recall and relate those experiences to themselves and to their societies.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov. I should also say, just for those joining us, the way we've organized it is we came up with a list of questions based on the survey we sent out, and if we have time at the end, we'll also get some questions from the audience. So first of all, thank you. That's really helpful. And especially what you said about like how does violence happen at the individual level? What makes it possible? What makes it possible for people to participate in violence? Um, I was looking at one of your op-eds from the last year, and you mentioned that during the first Intifada in the late 80s, when Yitzhak Rabin, who was the Minister of Defense, instructed the IDF to break the arms and legs of Palestinian protesters, you mentioned that you wrote a response to him, warning him that based on your research about indoctrination into the Nazi military, he was in some ways laying the groundwork, the psychological groundwork for increased domination and violence. What were the warning signs that made you send that letter? What were some of the trends or questions you were seeing? And where do those questions and trends stand now?
Yeah, so look, the warning signs were everywhere because at the time, The first Intifada began in December 1987. At the time already, there was growing brutalization of Israeli troops, and that often happens in situations of colonial rule, of oppression of other groups. But in this case, um, Rabin, who was Minister of Defense at the time and a much admired general going back to the War of 1948, was not only licensing it, but calling for it, calling for brutal behavior by heavily armed troops against mostly Palestinian teenagers who were throwing, rocks at students, at soldiers. So you could see a pattern. Now, this pattern began long before, and I should make a sort of reference to an article that came out at the time. It came out, I think, in March of 1988 by a professor of history who was my own professor at the time. Yehuda El-Kana is since passed. And Yehuda El-Kana himself was a child Holocaust survivor. And that gave him a kind of legitimacy to write that article. And what he wrote was an article titled In Praise of Forgetting. And what was he talking about that one should forget? He was saying that I wonder why I'm looking at myself here, the picture, by the way. Has
I think
something
we just
changed?
changed the view. So everybody's still
Oh,
there.
oh, okay. At the time, um, what he wrote was that Israeli youth, young men and women, had been exposed increasingly to a kind of education about the Holocaust that made them feel that they had license to exercise violence against others. Uh, Now, he's writing that in 1988, and it was somewhat scandalous to write that, of course, at the time, because you would have thought that um, obviously we have to remember the Holocaust. And what he was saying was that this constant harping on self-victimization among people who were born long after those events was giving them a particular sense of license to exercise violence against others. What we've seen since that, certainly going all the way to October 7th and to the way Israel has justified what it has done in Gaza, is an acceleration and intensification of that kind of rhetoric about the Holocaust, about the Nazi murder of the Jews in order to legitimize Israeli violence against Palestinians. So when I was writing that to Rabin, um, in a sense, what I was trying to say was that um, the one thing that motivated German troops in World War II and the crimes of the German military, especially on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, um, was a sense of victimhood, that they had been victims, as they saw it, of Jews and communists. That was the stab in the back legend, which had to do with the defeat of Germany in World War One, for which German nationalists and then Nazis accused Jews and communists. And so that they were, in a sense, taking revenge against those people that had stabbed them in the back, and they were preventing that from happening again. And this kind of logic of self-victimization, which then is exercised by perpetrating violence on others, is something that has gained great, I, I think, um, has intensified greatly between the time of the First Intifada and today. And we see that in the kind of abuse of references to anti Semitism and to the Holocaust as providing people with carte blanche, Israel, to not only exercise violence against Palestinians, but also to justify its decades long occupation and oppression of Palestinians.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov. Speaking of what you said about youth and the military, in an essay you wrote last August, you described some conversations you had with a group of Israeli students, many of whom were reservists who had just returned from Gaza. And they were protesting you giving a lecture at Ben Gurion because you'd signed a petition describing Israel as apartheid. You had written an op-ed in November 2023, warning that it was possible for the war to become genocidal. Um, and you shared just the way, on the one hand, they were protesting you on the one hand, but they also seemed to want you to hear them and listen to them, and they wanted some sort of approval from you, or they weren't having an opportunity to share what they were experiencing or thinking or feeling outside of that conversation. What were your observations, of that conversation with those students? What did you learn from talking to them? How did those conversations fit into some of the larger questions we've been talking about?
So look, this was June of 2024. I was visiting Israel and was invited to give a talk at Ben Gurion University. And when I came there, there was a bunch of students there who were protesting uh, my talk quite vehemently, that is, with bullhorns and banging on walls. They were quite aggressive. Um, and obviously, I couldn't hold the talk. And after a while, we just let them in on condition that they would agree to have a conversation. I said, okay, I'm not going to give my talk, which was actually supposed to be about the student protests in the United States and Europe, and the question whether these protests were anti-Semitic. Um, and I said, well, okay, I'm not going to do that. Let's just talk. And it was interesting in that sense. Now, you should understand that these students were activists in far-right organizations, in Im Tirtzu, which is a far-right NGO in Israel. Um, but these were students who had recently returned from reserve service in Gaza. So they had seen much more than I had seen, and much more than most people had seen, because they were right there. They were not only observing, but participating in the destruction, in the obliteration of Gaza. And what was interesting was that they felt, because they felt that I was blaming them of genocide, they said, we are not murderers. They repeated that a lot. We are not murderers. And they tried to show me their humanity. They showed me photographs on their phones of children, Palestinian children that they were feeding. They said that they were doing everything they can not to harm civilians, and at the same time, they were repeating the kind of propaganda that they were hearing from their own leaders, that there were no uninvolved people in Gaza, that the only solution to what occurred on October 7th was to wipe the whole thing out. And that anyone who resisted it, anyone who opposed it, anybody who criticized it in Israel or outside was anti-Zionist, anti-Israeli, and anti-Semitic. Um, and so to me, this was, it brought back to me um, some of what I had studied when I was much younger, when I was studying the German army and how German soldiers explained to themselves what they were doing. So again, I was on this personal level. And what was interesting about this was that although they were activists in far-right organizations, what they were saying was quite typical of what you would hear in Israel at the time, what I heard again when I was there in December of 2024, and what you still hear. It's a combination of trying to say that we are humane and they are human animals. That was the term that was kept being used. And they, meaning not just Hamas, but all those people over there, all the Palestinians, all the Gazans. We represent civilization. They represent barbarism. That's what Netanyahu kept saying as well, of course. That we have a right to do what we are doing, and at the same time, that we are not doing what we are accused of being doing. So there is a kind of logic both of affirming the need to do what they're doing and denying that this is what is happening, uh, affirming that you have to act brutally and claiming that you are on the side of civilization, of humanity, and the others are not human. And of course, the term that was used repeatedly and still is being used is that Hamas are Nazis. It's an association between the enemy of the Jewish people and Hamas. Um, and that the events of October 7th were just like the Holocaust, that this was the greatest killing of Jews since the Holocaust. So all these analogies to Nazism and the Holocaust that again give you license then to destroy others. So this was the kind of um, moment when I was sitting with them. What I felt, and that's what I wrote about, was that curiously, although they came to shut me up, when I sat and talked with them, they displayed uh, a real desire to speak and to be heard. And my sense was that nobody was speaking with them and nobody was hearing them. They felt betrayed by everyone. And in many ways, they are. Hundreds of Israeli soldiers died. They were buried with great fanfare, and that was it. Um, they had to believe that they were dying for some good cause. They could not accept that it might not be a good cause, that they might be doing the wrong thing. And that too is part of this logic of this kind of war, of feeling that you are betrayed, feeling that nobody is listening to you, and seeking some kind of explanation for why you're doing what you're doing and why this is happening to you. Um, and that, again, became part of a larger context in Israel. Most of the people that I know in Israel are not far right activists. Most of the people I know are left of center all the way to the so called radical left. Not that there is much of that in Israel. Um, and those people, too, were in the same kind of state of denial. So while they do not support Netanyahu or Ben Gvir or Smotrich, they also, I felt at least, were feeling somewhat uncomfortable in my presence, precisely because they knew what I'd said, what I'd written, and they did not want to talk about it. They did not really want to think about what the IDF was doing in Gaza. They were completely immersed in their own sense of victimhood. And to be sure, many people in Israel were directly or indirectly exposed to the violence of October 7th, including my own family. Uh, but because of that, they simply did not want to know about it. And this, again, this kind of denial, self justification, being immersed in a sense of mourning and trauma can serve as a trigger to licensing, to allowing the kind of violence that Israel has carried out in Gaza. And now, since it's supposedly over, to say, well, it's over and we don't need to talk about it any longer.
Thank you, Professor Bartov. Yeah, I was living in Jerusalem when the war started, and I think what you're describing really mirrors a lot of the experiences and conversations I had of friends and family who were otherwise quite liberal, all of a sudden sharing many of the things you said about there are no innocents. This is just they're barbaric, we're civilized, they're Nazis, all those things in a way that was really disturbing. But just for folks who are just joining us now, I want you to know we may have some time at the end for audience questions. So if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat. We may or may not get to them. We definitely won't get to all of them, but you should feel free to throw them in as we're going along, just so I can pick them up on the way. Professor Bartov, I want to zoom back out. You mentioned some of the stuff you were writing that was making your friends uncomfortable. In early November 2023, you wrote an op-ed in the Times saying that Israel's actions in Gaza were ethnic cleansing, but not genocidal, though they had the potential to be. In the spring of 2024, you argued that Israel had crossed the line into committing genocide. What were the specific developments that led you to change your analysis?
So in early November, 2023, I published an op-ed in the New York Times, and um, what I said there was that there was already sufficient evidence, it appeared, to show that Israel had carried out war crimes and likely crimes against humanity, because within the first 4 weeks of the campaign, over 10,000 people were killed in Gaza, mostly through aerial bombardments, indiscriminate aerial bombardments. Um, and most of them were civilians by most accounts. Um, and so, first of all, there was disproportionate use of force, which is a war crime, and there was extensive killing of civilians, which could come under crimes against humanity. And what I warned was that if this continued, it could become genocidal. Um, Now, there were two sets of statements that were being put out by Israeli leaders immediately after October 7th. One was relatively reasonable, which was that um, the goal of the operation in Gaza was to release the hostages. There were 251 hostages taken by Hamas, which itself is a war crime, and to destroy Hamas. And Hamas had launched a murderous operation and killed about 800 Israeli civilians. So this, on its face, appeared at least reasonable. But then there were many other statements being put out by the Minister of Defense, by the Prime Minister, by other generals and other politicians, uh, which could be boiled down to what Yoav Gallant said in the immediate aftermath of October 7th. They will have no food, they will have no water, they will have no power, they're human animals, and they will be treated appropriately, which itself is incitement to genocide by a man who is Minister of Defense when Israel is recruiting hundreds of thousands of reservists who look up to him as a general and a minister of defense. So the question was, which of these was the actual goal? Was it reflected in those statements, which people later described as irresponsible statements, or was it the goal of just destroying Hamas or releasing the hostages? By May of 2024, it became clear that the goal was not to release the hostages and destroy Hamas. Hamas is still standing, and most of the hostages were released only through ceasefire agreements with Hamas. The goal was to systematically destroy Gaza, to make Gaza uninhabitable for its population. In that sense, the goal was ethnic cleansing. Now, ethnic cleansing has failed, of course, because most of the Gazans are still living there. But what he did, it made Gaza uninhabitable. So the people who are living there now uh, are living in extraordinarily dire conditions. And as we know, over 70,000 at a minimum were killed, about 170 at a minimum were wounded, and there are hundreds of thousands of others who have been subjected to extraordinary violence, causing them physical and mental harm. This could be seen already by May. What sort of swayed my opinion was that in May, the IDF had reached Rafah, the southernmost city in Gaza, in which by then there were a million people. Half of the population of Gaza was concentrated there because they had been displaced repeatedly by the IDF, telling them to leave their homes because they would become areas of operation. Of course, then the IDF moved into their homes and demolished them. And because the IDF wanted also to take over Rafah, it moved those million people into Al Mawasi, into the beach area in southwestern Gaza, where there was no humanitarian infrastructure whatsoever, and proceeded to entirely level Rafah. By August, it was gone. And that appeared to sort of clinch the case that the goal was really to make Gaza uninhabitable. And in that, the IDF was fulfilling the conditions for to conform to the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention of 1948. That is, that it was trying to destroy, in whole or in part, the the Palestinian living in Gaza, identifying them as a particular group, and doing that by killing members of the group, by causing severe mental or physical harm to them, by creating conditions that would bring about their destruction, and by preventing births within the group because of the destruction of hospitals, the lack of food, lack of sanitation, that is indeed severely limited births within the Palestinians in Gaza. So four of the five conditions for genocide were actually fulfilled by the IDF. So I wrote about that in August of 2024 in The Guardian, and then I reiterated that in July of 2025 in another op-ed in the New York Times, by which time that became generally, I would say, the consensus opinion among both Holocaust scholars and experts in international law that the IDF was indeed engaged in a genocidal operation in Gaza.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov. I should also just say as a housekeeping thing, if folks also want to send me questions privately, you don't want to post it in front of the whole chat. I know one of the reasons we're all on this call is to learn. We're coming from different experiences, backgrounds, positions. So if you have a question that you want to explore, I can't promise that I'll ask it, but if you want to send it to me privately, you can also send it to me privately. So Dr. Bartov, one of the things I heard you getting at is, or maybe a related topic is right, the question of intent and how genocides emerge. In Holocaust and genocide studies, there's been a long-standing debate, and obviously these are ideal types, and most people fall somewhere on the spectrum, but a debate between intentionalists and functionalists. Intentionalists, I know I'm not explaining anything you don't know, but for our audience, intentionalists, people, the idea that genocide is driven by a clear, intentional plan from above. Functionalism, that genocide emerges through cumulative policies, institutional dynamics, and some sort of combination of dynamics from below and dynamics from above. I'm curious, like, how has that debate and some of that research shaped your understanding of Gaza? And also, what does it suggest in general about how otherwise, normal people, ordinary people, good people, and systems become implicated or participate in mass violence?
Yeah, so it's interesting to put it that way. I'm just coming back from the UK. I gave a talk at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, which is my alma mater, and my advisor there was a German historian, Tim Mason. People now don't remember him. Tim Mason was the guy who actually coined the term functionalism and intentionalism. And he originally coined it not regarding the Holocaust, which is the way it's usually understood now, but regarding how the Third Reich, the Nazi Germany in general, functioned. So the question, as it was understood eventually in Holocaust historiography, was whether there was an intent from the very beginning by Hitler and by the Nazi regime to carry out the genocide of the Jews. So Hitler thought about it maybe already in 1918 when he was coming out of World War I. And the question was how to implement it, but the intent was always there. Whereas functionalism spoke about the fact that Nazi Germany, as it was constructed, became a kind of behemoth that was made of competing agencies, which were competing over the favor of the Führer, of Hitler. And that created a dynamic of what some historians called cumulative radicalization. So that you knew that if you wanted to win the favor of Hitler, you had to propose the most radical solution to any problem, including, of course, to the Jewish question. And that led to this kind of radicalization of policies without there having been an original intent to actually murder all the Jews. The consensus today, of course, is kind of in between. It's neither one nor the other entirely. There is no proof at all that in 1933 or 35 or 38 or 39 there were plans to kill all the Jews of Europe. And what Germany wanted to do was to rid itself of Jews, to expel them. And this is where you can make an analogy. Um, and I've written that in several places. Many genocides, in fact, most modern genocides begin as ethnic cleansing. It's the desire of a regime, an organization, to rid itself of a particular group and take over the territory in which this group lives. But people don't like leaving their homes, and sometimes they can't leave their homes. So if they don't leave their homes, or if there's too many of them, or they fight back, they want to protect their homes, then this kind of ethnic cleansing becomes genocidal. And this happened in the genocide of the Herero in German Southwest Africa in 1904, and the genocide of the Armenians in World War I by the Ottoman regime starting in 1915. And the Holocaust itself actually begins with German policies trying to expel Jews from Germany, then from Austria. But the more Germany expands, the more territories it takes over, which have large concentrations of Jews. And the question is, how do we solve that problem? So you present yourself with a problem, and then you find, as one Nazi said, the most humane solution is just to kill them. And so that becomes genocide. In the case of Gaza, as I said before, I think that the goal was ethnic cleansing. And that goal of ethnic cleansing is not new. That goal of ethnic cleansing goes back to 1948. In 1948, when Israel is established and finds itself first in a civil war with the Palestinian population of mandatory Palestine, and then also with invading Arab armies, it uses that opportunity to make possible the creation of a Jewish majority state. Israel can no longer rely on the millions of Jews that Zionism hoped would come from Eastern Europe to create a Jewish majority state because they've been murdered by the Nazis. So there are a third of the population of mandatory Palestine are Jews and two-thirds are Arabs, are Palestinians. And in 1948, 750,000 of those Palestinians are expelled by first Jewish militias and then the IDF as it is formed. That is the majority expelled. That facilitates the creation of a Jewish majority state. It remains that until 1967. In 67, Israel takes over the rest of mandatory Palestine, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And from then on, it actually becomes again a 50-50 state to this day, where half of the population are Palestinians, whether they're Israeli citizens or occupied Palestinians, and the other half are Jews. So the goal of Zionism from the beginning was to create a Jewish majority state. The goal of people on the far right in Israel, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, but absolutely also now Netanyahu, is to make sure that there will not be a Palestinian state. And one way to do that is to either physically expel Palestinians or create conditions for them such that they would do everything they can to leave. This is the precondition for everything. And on October 7th, which was not planned by the Israeli government, flew entirely in the face of Netanyahu's prior logic, which was that we can manage the occupation. We don't need to make any territorial compromises. We'll just manage things. That management failed with the attack by Hamas. Once these people, Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, came out of the shock of the attack, they began seeing this as an opportunity. If we can't manage it, let's solve it by fire and sword. Let's kick them out, at least from Gaza. And of course, now on an accelerated level also in the West Bank. Uh, so there is a, if you like, there is a functional aspect to this. There is something that has been there from the beginning. There is also a particular intent. And you need, if you want to, at least by my book, if you want to define something as genocide, you have to also look specifically at the motivation for particular actions. And you find that motivation being expressed clearly by Israeli politicians and army people after October 7th. We have to carry out a second Nakba, a Gaza Nakba, as one of the ministers calls it. And you see a pattern of operations. And those two elements show intent, not the more general intent, creating a Jewish majority state, somehow solving this so-called Palestinian question, but a particular specific intent to solve, so to speak, the Palestinian question in Gaza by removing them from the strip.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov. Maybe one overlapping but adjacent, slightly different question is, um, international law has a particular standard of genocide, intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. Are there gaps or differences between the legal definition of genocide and a historical or sociological one? Could you have a functional genocide or a genocide that emerges functionally that does or does not meet the legal threshold? Are these definitions always overlapping?
Look, this is something that people have talked about for a long time, and increasingly so since October 7th, of course. There are scholars, um, just to mention maybe the best known and prominent one, Philip Sands, who has been sort of grappling with this question. He's the author of a book called East-West Street. I strongly recommend it. It's also a very well written book. And he talks there about the tension between the notion of crimes against humanity, that's one concept, and genocide is another concept, because for genocide, you have to show intent. The intent, as you said, to destroy a group in whole or in part as such. And and it's a crime about groups. You don't kill people just as individuals. You kill them as members of the group. Your intent is to destroy the group as a group, even if you don't kill all members of the group, that it would no longer exist as such. Whereas crimes against humanity includes extermination of civilian populations. If you exterminate people in large numbers, that would be a crime against humanity. And you don't have to show intent. You have done it, right? Whatever your intent was, you are guilty of having done it. And you don't have to identify them as a particular group. You're killing them as individual human beings. So there's a tension between the two. But as Philip Sands and others have said, the problem with the genocide, the term was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944, a Polish Jewish lawyer whose own family was killed in the Holocaust, but who started thinking about this in the wake of the Armenian genocide already before the Holocaust. The problem with the term is that people often use it not as a legal term, but as a term of outrage. That is, if you see large numbers of people being killed brutally, it must be genocide. What else would it be? And if somebody comes and says, well, you can't show intent to kill them as a group, people are outraged at you too. They say, but this is genocide. You can't call it anything else. It is, as Lemkin called it, the crime of crimes. It's the worst thing that can happen. Uh, and so the problem with that is that people hurl allegations of genocide at each other because they want to show that the other side is doing horrible things, right? In that sense, in Israel, people said what Hamas did to us was genocide. And had they been able to continue, they would have killed us all. They're a genocide organization. And Palestinians say Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza. And everyone feels that they're morally on the high ground. That's the reason that I insist on using the genocide definition of the UN Convention. Uh, A, because it's a pretty good definition. It has some problems, but it's a pretty good definition. B, because unlike crimes against humanity or even war crimes, genocide has a convention. That UN Convention of 1948 means that all signatory states of that convention, which includes most states around the world, including Israel and Germany and France and Britain and the United States, are obliged to adhere to what they signed. And the official name of that convention is the Convention uh, um, uh, on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So if you are a signatory state, you have to try and prevent genocide from happening when you see that it may be about to happen. You have to try to stop it when it is happening, and you're duty bound to punish those who carried it out. That's a very important element here. And we don't have it. There may be in the future a convention on crimes against humanity. There's talk about it, but there isn't right now. And having these conventions is very difficult. And a second very important thing about genocide that I want to stress, uh, unlike other horrific crimes, is that genocide tends to be a social event. I wrote a whole book on that, the book on the town of Buchach, where you see that on the local level. Genocide is a social event. That is, if you think about specifically about what Israel carried out in Gaza, and we talked about the kind of indifference and denial and refusal by Jewish Israeli citizens to acknowledge what was going on. Think about all the other organizations in Israel that could have and did not say anything about this. Think about the Bar Association in Israel. Think about the Association of Israeli Physicians. Think about university presidents and other scholars. All those people did not speak out as individuals and as representatives of organizations that ought to speak out. In that sense, everyone becomes complicit. Genocide sweeps everyone in, makes everyone complicit, which is one reason why people don't want to acknowledge it, because they understand, at least subliminally, that they are in fact part of it, whether they supported it or not, whether they even if they spoke out against it, at least in a democratic state. Genocide makes everyone complicit, and that's what organizations and states that carry it out want it to be. They want everyone to be part of it so that no one will be able to say, I could see and I was against it.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov. That is a really, yeah, just a really helpful way of, for me, of thinking about how these different definitions line up. What are some of the challenges of using them together, and also what you said at the end of once everybody is implicated in an event, then there's a huge psychological resistance to naming it as such. I've been monitoring the chat and just want to try to consolidate a couple of questions. We have about 18 minutes left. So one is just, there's been a lot of pushback, as you mentioned, within Israel and American and international Jewish institutions against labeling Israel's actions as a genocide. Some of them, from just war theorists who say, well, Hamas was embedded in a civilian population. There's nothing else. What else could Israel do? Some people who said, well, maybe this is a genocide, maybe not. But the fact is that some people are using that accusation in bad faith or said it too early, so we can't say it now. Could you just summarize maybe, either those or other of the main critiques you've heard of your position and how you'd respond to those?
Look, I mean, uh, there are various criticisms. I would say that they're on a range from completely reasonable and understandable criticism. I certainly don't think that I have, monopoly on truth, and people can argue with me to um, sort of ad hominem kind of attacks that one shouldn't really pay attention to. So, in terms of the more reasonable um, criticism of the genocide, of the allegation that Israel carried out genocide, uh, I'm clearly we don't have all the facts. We may never have them. If it were to depend on the Israeli government, we won't, because, as you know, Netanyahu has vehemently resisted establishing a state commission of inquiry, which is the only way to actually gather the evidence, both on the political and on the military level. And the longer the time passes, the more unlikely it is that we will have all the evidence we need, even about what happened on October 7th. Even regarding the crimes carried out by Hamas, we don't have a good investigation of any of that. So we can wait to see what the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, will adjudicate. It's going through the materials. It may um, rule that Israel carried out genocide. It may rule otherwise. It's not unlikely, to my mind, that it would say that there were genocidal actions carried out, but that the event as a whole, may not be. That's how they ruled about Serbia. So it's possible. I don't know. But these are certainly um, um, reasonable debates over whether Israel reached the high bar of genocide or not. I think it did. But Philip Sands is still sitting on the fence a little bit, although he's moving increasingly toward also adjudicating this as genocide. Um, Other sort of criticisms are, to me, quite bizarre. And I saw some of them, including Brett Stevens writing in response to my article in the New York Times a couple of weeks later. Reading his article, I thought that the New York Times must be on my side, because his article was so off the wall that if they published it, they couldn't have really thought that it would be convincing. So what are these arguments? For instance, if Israel really wanted to carry out genocide, it would have killed 1 million Palestinians right away. No problem. But it didn't. So if it killed only 70,000 or 100,000 or 150,000, that's not quite genocide. That's not high enough. That's a very strange argument to make, right? First of all, because you have to read the Genocide Convention, and the Genocide Convention does not necessitate killing everyone or even killing most people. As I said, it has a variety of sections. We know that large numbers of Palestinians died without being directly killed by Israelis because of the conditions created by the IDF, which led to their death or to serious physical and mental injuries, especially among children. So that sort of argument of numbers is I'd say it's curious, it's bizarre. It's also makes you think about the morality, the ethics of the people using that argument. A second argument is that yes, Hamas is embedded. It has hundreds of miles of tunnels under Palestinian communities, and therefore we don't have a choice. The only way to destroy Hamas is to destroy Gaza. That's also a very strange argument, because what it says is that the only answer to genocide or to an attack, let's say that what Hamas intended was genocide, which is somewhat dubious, but let's accept that argument. The only answer to genocide is genocide. The only way to destroy Hamas is to destroy Gaza, to destroy everything there. Nothing justifies genocide. Genocide is not a crime that you can justify. You can't say under particular conditions I could carry out genocide. And I give you an example. Um, when the Allies were fighting Nazi Germany was clearly guilty of genocide. The term didn't exist until the end of the war, but Nazi Germany led to the deaths of millions and millions of people intentionally, right? Uh, was there a justification then to respond to that by perpetrating genocide on Germany? There were voices that talked about that in the United States, in Britain, in the Soviet Union, but that was not what happened. When the Americans occupied Germany, what they did was the Marshall Plan. They actually handed over money to rebuild Germany, not because they were so humane, but because they thought that the best way to prevent this violence from happening again is to create a different kind of Germany and to help Germans build a different kind of Germany. Had Israel said that, had Israel said on October 7th or 8th, look, Hamas is a terrorist, murderous organization. It's not good for Palestinians either. And I would state that myself. Uh, let help us destroy that organization, and we will, together with you, create a different kind of Gaza. We'll unite it with the West Bank. We'll rebuild it, and we'll make it into a place that you will want to live in, and we will become good neighbors with each other. But that was, of course, not at all the Israeli policy. The policy of Israel was to use the opportunity of the attack by Hamas to destroy Gaza. So these sort of arguments, you know, and then of course the last one I will mention is the sort of whataboutism, uh, and and that's a very important point to be made because people say, well, why people around the world so exercised by what Israel is doing? Look at what Russia is doing and China is doing and Sudan and Myanmar and so forth. That's true. There are horrific things happening around the world. Russia is carrying out a criminal war in Ukraine. Myanmar has carried out genocide. Um, what is the difference? The difference is that Israel is a country that is supported precisely by those countries in the West, Germany and France and Britain and Italy and the United States that claim to be the protectors of human rights and the rule of international law. Those are the countries that put together this edifice of the Genocide Convention, of the Geneva Conventions, of the Rome Statute. They claim to be the defenders of that, and they have not only given Israel impunity to carry out genocide for 2 years, they have supported it. They have given it political cover, they've given it economic support, and they have flooded it with arms. That is unique, that a country is being supported in carrying out genocide by those very countries that claim to be the protectors of civilization, of human rights, and of international law. And in that sense, I can totally understand the outrage of Europeans and especially young Americans whose own tax dollars were being used to send Israel bombs that completely flattened Gaza.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov. Just to consolidate another set of questions, when I was living in Jerusalem, I spent a lot of time in the West Bank, and I saw the surge after October 7th of settler and military violence in the West Bank, of repression with inside 48. I'm curious, um, now, January 2026, what do you see as the current government in Israel's game plan? Like, what's the long-term strategy or short-term strategy they have vis-a-vis Palestinians, not just in Gaza, but also in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and within the Green Line? And then there's an emerging opposition bloc led by Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, Eisenkot. What do you see as do they have a long-term vision for these same questions? Is it, and in what ways is it or is it not substantively different? And that might be we have 7 minutes left, so that might be our last question.
Um, so Let me start this way. Uh, when I wrote that piece in November of 23, I was hoping that somebody in the Biden administration would pay attention and would stop Israel because the US could have easily stopped Israel. It always can. Israel is totally dependent on the US, and anybody who tells you otherwise is either ignorant or lying. Um, the I say this because, first of all, the Democrats in America and the Biden administration will be forever stained by having been complicit in Israel's genocide in Gaza. When Trump came in, and I'm hardly a Trump supporter, even before he walked into the White House, he forced Netanyahu into a ceasefire, which Netanyahu did not want. And that ceasefire lasted from January to March. Then Netanyahu broke the ceasefire, and there was another spate of massive killing, and Trump did not stop him. What we see now, that although there is ongoing violence, the so-called 20-point plan that I'll say something about in a minute, the one thing it did achieve was a reduction, a dramatic reduction in the destruction in Gaza. And that again was because Trump simply forced Netanyahu to do it, showing that, of course, any American president, if he wants to, or she, if we had had one, and I don't think that she would have done that, unfortunately, um, Kamala Harris, um, any president, any American president can stop Israel. And if they don't, it's for their own reasons. It's for internal reasons or strategic reasons or however they do it, but it's not because they cannot. They can. And this brings us to where we are now. Um, it, there's a lot that's murky right now. Uh, I think that what Netanyahu wants to reestablish, despite all odds, is October 6th. I think he wants to go back to managing the occupation under even harsher conditions for Palestinians. There is ongoing ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. There's now, even today and yesterday, there are reports, like the Jenin refugee camp, uh, from which 40,000 people were displaced, is now being paved with roads for tanks, and all these houses are being destroyed. And of course, communities in the Hebron Hills are being emptied one after another. So there's ongoing creeping ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And of course, the population of Gaza is living now in 48% of a strip that was one of the most densely populated areas in the world before October 7th, when they were living in the whole strip and without any infrastructure. I think that what Netanyahu wants to do is to go back to the way things were. Um, I'm not sure that that's what Trump wants. I think that what Trump wants, and it's not entirely in contradiction with Israeli goals, is in fact to create his little Riviera in Gaza. And to do that by moving populations from one side of the Gaza Strip to another, across that so-called yellow line, building some kind of resorts in his mind, and then using that population as a population that would serve those resorts. I mean, you need people to wash the dishes, to clean the streets, uh, using the populations as the helots, as the slaves of those beautiful villas and whatever they would be there of that Riviera. Uh, how that how these visions would coincide is a kind of give and take between the real estate moguls who are working for Trump, including himself and his family, and Israeli far-right people who want to get rid of the Palestinians and occupy that area, settle that area with their own type of settlements, which don't look exactly the same. Um, that I think is the way things are moving right now. I don't know where they're going now. Trump has already also created some kind of board, which is by all intents and purposes is a kind of replacement for the UN. Whether he can push it through with the few bizarre world leaders, because none of the Europeans have joined it, is questionable. But he's also pushing in that direction. Now you asked about the Israeli opposition. The Israeli opposition, if you read what they're not saying anything different. This is not to say that I would not be happy if Netanyahu were voted out of office, or if his pacer faltered, or if he just decided to retire for health reasons, um, because he is a particular um, super corrupt individual who has corrupted the entire, not only political, but also economic and social system in Israel. He's poisoned the entire society over years, and removing him would be a good thing, uh, especially for Jewish Israelis. But for Palestinians, if Bennett came into power, or Lapid, or whoever it might be, they are not offering anything different. They have not provided any blueprint for some kind of the only thing, some version of the only thing that will change the political paradigm in the area, which is a formula for these two groups, 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians, to coexist, to live side by side in justice, with dignity and equality. They are not thinking about that at all. And the proof in the pudding is that they're not even willing to go in coalition with Arab parties in Israel, which is the only way for the so-called Israeli left, or let's call it the opposition, to topple the right. That's the only way that you can actually do it electorally. And they're unwilling to coordinate or to cooperate with Arab parties. So um, there may be a dynamic once Netanyahu is gone, if he's gone, and I'm not at all sure that he's going to lose the next elections. There may be a dynamic of change, but they have not come with any kind of real alternatives to Israeli policy right now.
Thank you, Dr. Bartov. Really appreciate both your analysis today and also the analysis you've provided for the last 2 years and the framework you've offered us for understanding what's happening in Gaza and Israel-Palestine more generally. And I'm grateful for your work. I'm going to pass it back to Caroline and Aaron to close us up. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. And thank you to Professor Bartov and to Rabbi Wander. So for those of you who joined later, this event was hosted by Halachic Left. Aaron, the other Aaron, the one who didn't moderate, already gave a pitch at the beginning, but I'm going to go ahead and drop some links in the chat for people who aren't familiar. Um, we we have an email list for anyone who wants to join, and also a couple of WhatsApp groups. We also have a feedback form for this event, so if you have any feedback, we'd love to hear it. We also have a suggestion form for future speakers. Um, and I also dropped a link for our book club meeting next week for those who are interested in that. But yeah, thank you so much for coming. Have a wonderful Sunday. And if you're affected by the snow, please stay safe. And bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.